Wednesday night. We're continuing our study of the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, the two books that historically cover the time period when the Jews returned from captivity. We've already covered Ezra, and we're well into our study of Nehemiah. Tonight our study centers on Nehemiah's chapter 5 and 6. Nehemiah chapters 5 and 6. We know that Nehemiah had come especially and purposefully with the intention of rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem. So over a period of about 85 or 90 years, the Jews had been coming back from their captivity. The first group led by Zerubbabel. About 70 years later, a group led by Ezra. Remember, Zerubbabel came back with the idea of rebuilding the temple. It took a while to get it done, but they got it done. Actually, try to remember this. Zerubbabel came back, they laid the foundations of the temple, and then because of opposition, they stopped. And it took the prophets Haggai and Zechariah to about 20 years later to really motivate them, rebuke them actually, and chide them for having not finished the work of the temple. So after about 20 years, they got busy and they finished the temple and consecrated the temple in Jerusalem. But the city was still in ruins. Ezra led a group back about 70 years later. Ezra led a group back to, I like to think of it, rebuild the people spiritually. So Zerubbabel rebuild the temple, Ezra rebuild the people spiritually. But the city was still in ruins. The walls of the city were all torn down and the gates of the city had been burned. And so although the temple was there, the city itself was still in ruins. And when Nehemiah found out about that, he was cupbearer to the king. And when he found out about that, he was terribly distraught and asked for permission and was granted permission and supplies and money and whatever was needed to go back and rebuild the city walls. And so Zerubbabel, temple, Ezra, spiritually build the people, Nehemiah build the walls. That's a pretty good way to remember how that all progressed. All right, so as they are in the process of building the walls, in chapter 5, look in chapter 5 now, a problem arises. Verse 1, there was a great cry of the people and of their wives against their brethren, the Jews, for there were that said, we, our sons, our daughters are many. Therefore we take up corn for them that we may eat and live. Some also there were that said, we have mortgaged our lands, vineyards, and houses that we might buy corn because of the dearth. There were also that said, we have borrowed money for the king's tribute and that upon our lands and vineyards. Yet now our flesh is as the flesh of our brethren, our children as their children. And lo, we bring into bondage our sons and daughters to be servants. And some of our daughters are brought unto bondage already. Neither is it in our power to redeem them, for other men have our lands and our vineyards. All right, so you'd like to think you could get, I'm sure if you were Nehemiah, you'd like to think, I'm going to come in there with this big construction project. We're going to hit it hard. We're going to knock it out. We're going to get this job done, and everything would just fall in place just like clockwork. It never happens that way, does it? There are always things that come up and issues. I mean, it's true in our lives when we're trying to get something done. It always has been so, and certainly Nehemiah wasn't anticipating having to deal with this kind of a problem, but the problem was there. What had happened, notice it mentions that there was a dearth. We'd call it a drought or something of that nature. For some reason, the crops were not making well. Our author referred us to Haggai. And in the book of Haggai, Haggai mentioned that God would cause them trouble if they weren't faithful. But Haggai, you got to remember, Haggai was much earlier than this, several decades earlier when Haggai said this. But notice what Haggai said in chapter 1 of Haggai, verse 7. Thus saith the Lord of hosts, consider your ways. Go up to the mountain, bring wood, build the house. I will take pleasure in it. I will be glorified, saith the Lord. Ye looked for much, and lo, it came to little. And when ye brought it home, I did blow upon it. Why, saith the Lord of hosts? Because of mine house that is waste, and ye run every man to his own house. Therefore the heaven over you is stayed from dew, and the earth is stayed from her fruit. And I called for a drought upon the land, upon the mountains, upon the corn, upon the new wine, upon the oil, upon that which the ground bringeth forth, and upon men, and upon cattle, and upon all the labor of the hands. Now again, Haggai was talking about a situation earlier, but the point he's making is the same. And we have the advantage of special revelation here to identify that God was causing these hardships to come upon the people because they weren't being loyal and faithful to Him. Now, we couldn't do that today. So, from time to time we have droughts. And we're not able to say with a certainty God sent that drought as a punishment upon the people. We can't say that because we don't have direct revelation. But back in those times when God still was working with inspired prophets, it was possible to know that they were suffering hardship because of their neglect and their sins. And so you'd have to think that what Haggai said from several decades earlier was true again, that the land wasn't bringing forth its yield because the people weren't being faithful. So the people come to Nehemiah and they have a complaint. We've got big families, we've got lots of children, and we don't have anything to eat. And we've had to mortgage our homes, we've had to mortgage our vineyards, we've had to sell off everything that we've got. Our children have even been forced into slavery, or what we would probably call indentured servitude. In other words, it wasn't like slavery as we usually picture it, but sometimes if you didn't have money, you had to sell yourself for a period of time in order to make some money and get out of debt. And their sons and their daughters and the like had been sold in this fashion because times were hard. But more so than the times being hard, the people who had money were taking advantage of the situation. They were, I guess what we would call it, they were charging excessive interest rates. Well, people needed money. They said, I'll loan you money, but it's going to cost you this much in order to have the money. So that was the situation. And the people were complaining to Nehemiah because they notice there at the end of verse 5, neither is it in our power to redeem them, our children, for other men have our lands and our vineyards. We don't have anything left. And now our children have been sold into slavery, and we don't have anything left to redeem them or buy them back out of their slavery. And notice verse 6, Nehemiah said, I was very angry when I heard their cry and these words. Now, maybe a little bit of review of the law of Moses might help to explain why Nehemiah would be so angry with that situation. Go back to Exodus 22. In Exodus 22, beginning at verse 21, thou shalt neither vex a stranger nor oppress him, for ye were strangers in the land of Egypt. Ye shall not afflict any widow or fatherless child. If you afflict them in any wise, and they cry at all unto me, I will surely hear their cry. And my wrath shall wax hot, and I will kill you with the sword, and your wives shall be widows, and your children fatherless. If you lend money to any of my people that is poor by thee, thou shalt not be to him as a usurer, neither shalt thou lay upon him usury. If thou at all take thy neighbor's raiment to pledge, thou shalt deliver it unto him by that the sun goeth down, for that is his covering only. It is his raiment for his skin. Wherein shall he sleep? And it shall come to pass, when he crieth unto me, that I will hear, for I am gracious. So, there were special provisions in the law of Moses that you're not supposed to take advantage of situations. You get people in dealing with the issues of poverty, by all means, don't take advantage of that. And notice specifically that they were not to charge usury. We would say interest. Usury is synonymous with interest. And so if you loan them money, don't be charging them interest for the money that you loan them. And be gracious unto them, because God was saying through the law of Moses, if you don't, you can expect that I will punish you because you have not been kind to the poor and the oppressed. So that, I think, explains why Nehemiah was so angry when he found out that this situation existed. There was a dearth, there was a hard time, probably likely brought on by God punishing the people for not being faithful. The poor were suffering inordinately from the dearth that was upon them. And so this situation had developed, and some people were taking, I guess bottom line you would say there were people who were taking advantage of the situation. Now, think about that for a minute. Is that a common reality among humankind? It is, isn't it? People will take advantage of a bad situation if they're in a position to do so. That's just sort of been human nature right through. It was true here. It's true today. Obviously, we would not want to be people of that sort. Obviously, God is not pleased when it's like that. All right, any thoughts or comments on the situation as it has developed? All right, notice at verse 7 then. Then I consulted with myself, and I rebuked the nobles and the rulers and said to them, Ye exact usury, every one of his brother, and I set a great assembly against them. Okay, now stop there for a minute. What do you think that means in verse 7? I consulted with myself. I don't have anybody else to talk to. I just talked to myself. How would you put that? How would you paraphrase that? Wayne, what does he mean?
Yeah, I thought about this, or I was, going back and forth about what to do.
Yeah, I pondered it over and in fact, I think the New International Version says, I pondered them in my mind. And so he thought about it. And then, notice, he said, I consulted with myself and I rebuked the nobles. I thought maybe there's a very simple little lesson there. Instead of just flying off the handle when he heard this bad news, he spent a little while thinking about it before reacting. That's typically pretty good advice, and I've often needed that kind of advice because, in the heat of the moment, if you react quickly, you're very liable to say something that you'll be sorry for later. And so Nehemiah probably sets a very worthy example for us. There's step back, think about it a minute before you open your mouth and address the situation. And then you'll probably do much better and be less likely to say something you'll be sorry for. So I thought that might be worth underlining there in verse 7. I consulted with myself and then I rebuked the nobles. He rebukes the nobles and the rulers. Oh, wait a minute. These are the power brokers, right? The nobles and the rulers, these are the top dogs. You don't want to get on their bad side, Nehemiah. Maybe you need to just look the other way on this because these are the power brokers among the Jews. Maybe you don't want to go out on a limb here and get on their bad side. Not Nehemiah. Nehemiah goes right at them. I mean, he confronts them. He does not sweep it under the rug. He doesn't look the other way. This is wrong. What they're doing is wrong, and they're not going to get by with it in Nehemiah's estimation anyway. So he rebukes the nobles and the rulers, said unto them, Ye exact usury, every one of his brother, and I set a great assembly against them. So you get the idea that the people who were doing this oppressive interest taking, probably a fairly small group of people, powerful people, but not a lot of people. And so Nehemiah rebukes them, and he calls a big assembly of people together to also put pressure on them for their evil deeds. And so he gets a lot of people together to join with him in opposing these rulers and nobles who were charging this excessive usury. Notice, keep reading there, verse 8. I said to them, We, after our ability, have redeemed our brethren the Jews, which were sold unto the heathen. And will ye even sell your brethren, or shall they be sold unto us? Then they held their peace and found nothing to answer. Also I said, It is not good that ye do. Ought ye not to walk in the fear of our God because of the reproach of the heathen, our enemies? So basically he reminds them, we were all effectively in bondage. And we were delivered from it, and now you're going to be the one who puts other people in bondage? It doesn't even seem logical or reasonable that they would do that. Come on. What are you thinking here, basically, is what Nehemiah says. We all came from that situation, and we've been delivered from it, and now you are trying to put others back in that situation. His logic and his reasoning was so sound. There at the end of verse 8 it says they held their peace and found nothing to answer. They were left without a defense. So we've talked, as we've been studying Nehemiah, that Nehemiah was just really an effective leader. And here again, I think you see evidence of his great leadership skills. He got the people together. He opposed these nobles and rulers for their wrongs. And he was able to present his case so effectively and forcefully that they were left speechless. They didn't have an answer. They couldn't respond when he put it on them this way. I'm going to tell you, that's a pretty wise and good approach that Nehemiah used. If you can go at someone, if you can rebuke someone, if you can take a matter up with a person that needs to be rebuked, but you can do it in such a fashion that they're not able to even offer a flimsy excuse as to what they've done. He used a good approach, and it was successful. Now Nehemiah says that he says in verse 10 that he himself had avoided doing this very sort of thing. Verse 10, I likewise and my brethren and my servants might exact of them money and corn. I pray you let us leave off this usury. I think what he's saying, and I believe that I've got the ESV here. He says, we are lending money and grain. Let us abandon this exacting of interest. So Nehemiah says, as for me, we're freely lending food and grain, even money, to help out these people who are in such bad condition. And so Nehemiah is basically saying, I'm not calling on you to do something that I myself am unwilling to do. Me and my servants, we've been freely lending money and grain to these oppressed people. Again, that's a pretty good thing for leaders to pay attention to. You don't just tell people what to do, you show them what to do. You demonstrate and set a proper example. And Nehemiah did that, right? I think he's saying there in verse 10, as for me and my servants, we've been freely giving these things to the people who need them. Let's stop this interest business. And so, notice the outcome. Verse 11. Restore, I pray you, to them even this day their lands, their vineyards, their olive yards, and their houses, also the 100th part of the money and of the corn, the wine, the oil that ye exact of them. Then they said, we will restore them, and will require nothing of them. So will we do as thou sayest. Then I called the priests and took an oath of them that they should do according to this promise. Also I took my lap and said, so God shake out every man from his house and from his labor that performeth not this promise, even thus be shaken out and emptied. And all the congregation said, Amen, and praised the Lord. And the people did according to this promise. He got the job done, didn't he? You know, if you think about that could sure have gone a different way. I mean, the people could have bowed their backs and said, forget you, Nehemiah, we're done with you. And remember, they were the guilty parties were the power brokers here who could have made it go a different way. But he was so compelling and so convincing and so effective in the way that he approached this problem. He got them to, it looks like, pretty immediately agree that they would stop their practice and restore the things that they had taken from the people in an oppressive way. And then I thought it was pretty interesting there in verse 13 how Nehemiah uses sort of a visual aid, if you will, to sort of re-emphasize the point he's making. He takes his apron and he shakes it out, and he says, that's what God will do to you. If you don't follow through with this promise you're making, you will be shaken out, and God will bring this punishment upon you. And so he got the problem done, fixed it, and they're ready to move on. So think about this in the big picture. They're busy building the walls of the city, and now this problem comes up. Oh, what are we going to do? This could derail the whole project. This could put a stop to all the good things that are getting done. So do you ignore it and hope it goes away on its own? Do you look the other way because it's the nobles and the rulers who are the guilty parties? No. You address it directly. Deal with it. Don't let it pass. And Nehemiah's skills as a leader are clearly on display here when he's able to solve this problem. Thoughts or comments? Anybody? John?
It's interesting how he's able to overcome their strong-willed or their ill-willed, concepts there. Because we read in a lot how people got their conscience seared, or they're not bothered by that stuff anymore. It seems like if they're doing that kind of stuff against God's will and pushing even slavery to children or what have you, it seems like the conscience would have been pretty seared.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is he was dealing with a tough audience here, and yet he was still successful. Yeah, I think you're right. Any other thoughts here? Wade?
Yeah. You just have to admire him, right? Because just like you said, it's going to go the other way.
Yeah.
And I mean, they could have just taken him out and stoned him and did what they wanted to do.
Yeah.
But that sets an example for us. No matter what the odds are, we have to take the truth and do what's right in the truth. There's been a lot of people over the years that's got a good example of that. And then there's been a lot of people over the years that just said, I'm just going to go with whatever the crowd says, and that way I don't get beat up, I don't get demoralized, but that's not what we should be. We should be like him.
Exactly right. He's such a really great example. Anything else? All right. So, again, Nehemiah's personal example, the rest of this chapter, he deals with his example of how he had been conducting himself in the course of this time. Verse 14, moreover, from the time that I was appointed to be their governor in the land of Judah, from the 20th year even to the 32nd year of Artaxerxes the king, that is 12 years, I and my brethren have not eaten the bread of the governor. But the former governors that had been before me were chargeable unto the people, and had taken of them bread and wine, beside 40 shekels of silver. Yea, even their servants bear rule over the people, but so did not I, because of the fear of God. Yea, also I continued in the work of this wall, neither bought we any land, and all my servants were gathered thither unto the work. Moreover, there were at my table 150 of the Jews and rulers, besides those that came unto us from among the heathen that are about us. Now that which was prepared for me daily was 1 ox and 6 choice sheep. Also fowls were prepared for me, and once in 10 days store of all sorts of wine. Yet for all this required not I the bread of the governor, because the bondage was heavy upon this people. Think upon me, my God, for good, according to all that I have done for this people. I think that's pretty straightforward, isn't it? He said, as governor, he had rights to take a certain levy from the people for what he was doing. Provisions and money. I mean, it was in his power to do that. And he actually said, the governors who were before me did do that. The governors before me were taking their share, but not me. And he mentions he didn't take anything, and that in fact, apparently of his own substance, he provided a significant supply of food for many people who were involved in the project of building the walls. And so he said, and by the way, he said, we didn't buy any land. We were in you got to think, I mean, he is in a position to get the best deals on real estate. I mean, he's got an inside track, doesn't he? He's got an inside track. If a good deal on a piece of land comes up, Nehemiah had been one of the first ones to know it. He could have snapped it up before anybody else even knew it was available. He didn't. What he's saying here is that he absolutely did not take advantage of his position. But he was very selfless and sacrificial in the way that he dealt with all of this work that was being done. Again, you just got to admire Nehemiah for so many reasons. I got a question for you, though, about verse 19. So he just lists his own conduct and then prayerfully says, think upon me, my God, for good, according to all that I have done for this people. You think that's appropriate for him to say, God, now this is what I've done, God, and I want you to notice that, God, and I want you to bless me for the things that... What do you think about that? I mean, I have known, I think, of some people who were put off by Nehemiah saying, here's what I've done, and God, don't forget that I did all this and bless me accordingly. What do you think? Are you put off by it, Wayne? What do you think?
No, I think it's perfectly fine to say that, this is how I've served you, Lord.
Yeah.
Because in verse 15 he said, I didn't do this because of fear of God.
Yeah.
And he's just relating his conduct before God, the way he's reacted because of the fear of God.
Yeah, exactly right.
I don't think he's bragging about himself.
I think that's the key right there. It wasn't that he was boasting, but he did want God to remember the good he had done. Sometimes a common expression that men will use when they're leading us in prayer, and Lord, in the final judgment, give us a home in heaven if we've been found faithful. Well, God has already said that he would give us a home in heaven if we're found faithful. But we're just asking for reaffirmation of that promise that God would do that. And so I don't think, I could not condemn Nehemiah's expression here. He's just asking for God's blessings, although God had already promised such blessings to faithful people. But he's just asking for that. Oh, Wade.
So... He's talking to God. God knows what he did.
Yeah.
And he's not bragging at other men.
It's not like he's standing on the housetop shouting this out.
He's not shouting at men. He's talking to God, which he knows God knows what he did. But he's just asking him to bless him for what he's done.
Yeah. I think you're right. John?
I think you'll hear also in prayer, sometimes folks will ask the Lord to continue to bless us in the ways that we already have.
Yeah.
It's not because we believe we deserve so much more, but because the things that he's done and he's benefited us and those around us, we pray that he'll continue to do so we can continue to do that.
I think you're right. Clayton?
I was just comparing it to Nebuchadnezzar. It's totally different.
Yeah. Nebuchadnezzar was bragging
Yeah.
about all that he had accomplished and the great gardens that he had made and all of that. And he was brought down immediately. Yeah.
God in any of that.
Yeah, good point. Good comparison. All right. Let's move quickly into chapter 6. Now we get back to the opponents who are trying to stop the building of the wall. In chapter 6, beginning at verse 1. Now it came to pass when Sanballat and Tobiah and Geshem the Arabian and the rest of our enemies heard that I had builded the wall and that there was no breach left therein, though at that time I had not set up the doors upon the gates, that Sanballat and Geshem sent unto me, saying, come, let us meet together in one of the villages in the plain of Ono. But they thought to do me mischief. And I sent messengers to them, saying, I am doing a great work, so that I cannot come down. Why should the work cease while I leave it and come down to you? And so this passage, this part of this story has been used, I think, effectively lots of times. They're trying to distract Nehemiah from his leadership in building the walls of the city. They're trying to get him basically to compromise, and he's not inclined to do it at all. Sometimes, and I don't know if you've ever heard this, but I've heard old preachers before talk about meeting on the plains of Ono. Wayne, you probably have too. It's sort of an expression that's been used to denote compromising in the work of God. to meet on the plains of Ono. And Nehemiah said, I'm not doing it. Why would I stop from the important work that's being done here to meet with you? There's no sense in it. But there was an indication, and I don't know, we know it because the scripture says that they thought to do me mischief. I think Nehemiah was aware of that, and the way it's stated there suggests at that time he knew that they had evil intentions. If they could distract him, get him away from the city. Think about this. If you are Sanballat and Tobiah, what would be the best thing? You want this project to stop, right? What would be the best thing that could happen? Kill Nehemiah. He's just such a good leader. If we can get rid of him, we can probably bring this whole thing to a halt. But as long as he's there and as long as he's working like he's working, we're not going to succeed. So you can imagine that they probably had this evil intention to do him harm. He says no. They don't take no as an answer. Verse 4, yet they sent unto me 4 times after this sort, and I answered them after the same manner. So, try to get somebody to compromise. Initially, they say no. Keep coming back and offer the same thing over and over again. Maybe you can wear them down. Nehemiah's not worn down. He answers them exactly the same way. Each time they keep presenting this idea of meeting together. I think there's probably a good takeaway in that. I mean, even for us today, what are we? We're 2,500 years later. 2,500 years ago is when this happened with Nehemiah. People still try to do that, right? They try to get us to compromise our convictions, compromise our work. And so that's not uncommon. That's a typical approach of the enemies of God, to try and get us to compromise. Nehemiah was not inclined to do that. But notice then at verse 5, then sent Sanballat his servant unto me in like manner the 5th time with an open letter in his hand. So they're up in the ante here a little bit. He says, wherein was written, this is the letter that Sanballat had. It is reported among the heathen, and Gashmu saith it, that thou and the Jews think to rebel, for which cause thou buildest the wall, that thou mayest be their king, according to these words. And thou hast also appointed prophets to preach of thee at Jerusalem, saying, there is a king in Jerusalem. And now shall it be reported to the king according to these words, come now therefore and let us take counsel together. Okay. So he's upping it. He's taking it up a notch, isn't it? He's saying, so there's an open letter, and the threat is this is going to be sent into King Artaxerxes, back the Persian king who's over this entire empire. We're about to send this letter. I want you, if you should come and meet with us, because we're about to send this letter. And the letter says that you're building the walls of Jerusalem so that you can lead a rebellion against King Artaxerxes, that you in fact intend to appoint yourself, probably have already done so, appointed yourself as king over Jerusalem, and that you have hired false prophets to prophesy that you should be the king, that this is of God. And we're about to send this letter to the king to let him know what you're up to. So, what do the enemies of truth do? They lie. Right? The enemies of truth lie. And this is complete fabrication, right? There's not a shred of truth in it, not a shred. But this is the story that they're going to tell, and they're threatening to send this open letter to the king, Artaxerxes. Again, I'm always so impressed that human nature is effectively unchanged over centuries. We see that in political developments of our day. You know, political people have no qualms about lying. I mean, you've heard the old joke, how can you tell if a politician is lying? If his lips are moving. That's what politicians do, and that's what these guys are doing, right? There's not a shred of truth in it, but they're threatening Nehemiah that they're going to send this letter back to Artaxerxes. Wayne?
And who are all these enemies? If you go back to chapter 4 or 5, They are from Samaria.
Yeah.
Why was Samaria destroyed? Because they had made a pact with Egypt to overthrow the rule of Sennacherib of the Assyrians. And so they came down and just wiped them out.
Yeah.
They're doing the very same thing that they're accused. They did the very same thing they're accusing Judah of doing.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, that's so typical even to our day. It's so often today, you'll hear politicians making accusations against others, when in fact the accusation they're making against others is descriptive of what they themselves are doing. It's so common. It's just absolutely amazing. All right, so Nehemiah responds, verse 8, Then I sent it to him, saying, There is no such things done as thou sayest, but thou feignest them out of thine own heart. For they all made us afraid, saying, Their hands shall be weakened from the work, that it might not be done. Now therefore, O God, strengthen my hands. So he knew, he was completely aware of what their purpose and what their intention was, to discourage the people, to scare them, to frighten them, make them stop working. Nehemiah is nobody's dummy. He's completely on top of this situation. He's fully aware of what these people are trying to accomplish. Keep reading there at verse 10. Afterward I came into the house of Shemaiah, the son of Delaiah, the son of Mehethabiel, who was shut up. And he said, Let us meet together in the house of God within the temple, and let us shut the doors of the temple, for they will come to slay thee, yea, in the night will they come to slay thee. And I said, Should such a man as I flee? And who is there that, being as I am, would go into the temple to save his life? I will not go in. And lo, I perceived that God had not sent him, but that he pronounced this prophecy against me, for Tobiah and Sanballat had hired him. Therefore was he hired, that I should be afraid and do so in sin. They might have matter for an evil report, that they might reproach me. My God, think upon Tobiah and Sanballat according to these their works, and on the prophetess Noadiah and the rest of the prophets that would have put me in fear. So now a personal assault on Nehemiah to try and strike fear in him. And so this guy, this Shemaiah, it says he was shut in, and I think one of the other versions says he was confined at home. And so maybe he was an older man, maybe he was an infirm person. Maybe he was an old man who had garnered some respect among the citizenry. We just don't know too much about him. But he says, come meet me in the temple. We'll shut you up in the temple because they're coming. They're going to come in the night. They're going to kill you. Now, I think they would. I got to believe that Sanballat and Tobiah would have loved to kill Nehemiah, given the chance to do so. I don't think that's an idle threat. But this guy says, come with me into the temple. Well, what's the problem with that? What's the problem with, come with me into the temple. We'll shut it up. We'll shut you inside. Because if we don't, they're going to come and kill you. Wait.
Paul was basically told the same thing. The prophet, I think it was Agabus, he put those belts around his arms.
Yeah.
And he said, whoever wears this belt is going to be in prison, basically.
Yeah.
And Paul said, I'm going.
Yeah.
I'm going to.
But I think in that case, Agabus was given a true prophecy. I mean, this is all made up. This is all pretense. So that would be the difference here.
But that makes it even worse.
Yeah.
Because now Paul knew exactly what was going to happen.
Yeah.
And, but Ezra's doing, or Nehemiah's doing the same thing. He's like, I don't care.
Yeah.
We're going to do this. We're going to get it through. I don't care.
But there's another key element too. You're right. Nehemiah is not dissuaded. But there's another key element. What's the other key element here? Nehemiah has no authority to go into the temple, right? Notice he said that they would cause me to sin, that they might have a matter of an evil report, that they might reproach me. Verse 13. Nehemiah is not a Levite, not a priest. And so if they could scare him into going into the temple and locking himself into the temple, first of all, it would have taken him away from the work and from the leadership that he's providing in this work. But even more basically, he has no authority to go into the temple. He's not a priest. He is not going to go. And he realizes that this man, Shemaiah, has been hired by Sanballat and Tobiah in order to do this, to try and get him to do something that they could accuse him about later. Again, if you get him to do it, then you can widely report, oh yeah, this Nehemiah, he acts like a real righteous guy, but did you know what he just did? I mean, they're looking, and I think it's always significant that when enemies can't find anything bad to say about you and have to make up things to say about you, you're doing pretty well. Nehemiah is under tight scrutiny here, and yet they're having to try to invent a situation whereby they could accuse him. And so that speaks to his noble character and his conduct. All right, so here's the key verse, verse 15. Oh, by the way, verse 14. He calls on God again to remember what these evil workers are trying to do. And deal with them accordingly. You know, he's just asking for God's justice. That's not a bad thing. It's not wrong. It's not wrong to call on God's justice. God is a God of justice. And when there are evil people like these, it's not wrong to call upon God to be exercising his justice against them. And verse 14, Nehemiah does that. All right, now, here's the key verse. So the wall was finished in the 25th day of the month Elu in 52 days. I mean, that's you know, I suppose if you were playing a game of Bible trivia, that might be a Bible trivia question. How long did it take Nehemiah and the people to build the walls of the city? 52 days. But it's more than a trivia answer. It's an amazing accomplishment when you think about it. This was a major construction project. And realize that they didn't have modern tools and equipment and hydraulics and skid steers and mini excavators, Mitchell. They didn't have the kind of tools that we would have employed to do a similar job to that. It's amazing work. Wayne?
Yeah, they did it while they had their sword right by their right hand. Work with one hand, had their sword there.
Exactly right. They were working with half strength almost because they had to defend themselves. Amazing accomplishment. 52 days. Let's read real quickly in the chapter. It came to pass, verse 16, it came to pass that when all our enemies heard thereof and all the heathen that were about us saw these things, they were much cast down in their own eyes, for they perceived that this work was wrought of our God. Moreover, in those days the nobles of Judah sent many letters unto Tobiah, and the letters of Tobiah came unto them. For there were many in Judah sworn unto him, because he was son-in-law of Shechaniah, the son of Arah, and his son Johanan had taken the daughter of Meshullam, the son of Berechiah. Also they reported his good deeds before me, and uttered my words to him, and Tobiah sent letters to put me in fear. So the last verses there, again, when the enemies realized that the work had been accomplished and the city walls were built and finished, they were pretty just downhearted. They were very discouraged, disappointed. They had not been able to put a stop to all of this. But sort of as a side note, that Nehemiah is working and has been working under a handicap due to the fact that Tobiah had a lot of people inside. I don't know, we might refer to them in our terminology, maybe he had moles within Jerusalem. He had his agents, and they were sending letters back and forth to Tobiah, keeping him informed. They were also trying to present Tobiah to Nehemiah in a favorable light. They reported his good deeds before me, uttered my words to him. Tobiah sent many letters to put me in fear. And so Tobiah is not done with his opposition. And he's got some people on the inside of Jerusalem who are trying to help him accomplish his agenda. And that's always a bad thing. I mean, that's a hard thing to deal with. You know, you'd like to think that your own people are going to be loyal and supportive. And in this case, Nehemiah is aware that's not totally the case. All right, you got to really be impressed with Nehemiah. I mean, what he has accomplished and is accomplishing very, very incredibly impressive. And so, Lord willing, we'll continue our study there next week.